Welcome to Managing Sexuality Intelligently. My name is Jason, and I'm here with Stephen Ng, marriage and family therapist. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Cool. Today we are discussing toxic masculinity. I'm not exactly sure what toxic masculinity means. I'm definitely aware of the idea, but for me, it's like one of those things that has so many definitions, I don't even know where to really begin with it all. Before we get into all that, if you have any questions you'd like Steve to answer on the podcast, visit stevening.com and fill out the contact form. At the end of each episode, Steve will answer a listener question, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Okay, Steve, toxic masculinity. How would you define this?
Well, actually, for me, it's a double-edged sword as a term. Because I think it's usually used pejoratively about men in general. Mm-hmm. Anytime a guy has some kind of a struggle regarding masculinity, or maybe he's violent, suddenly everything gets painted with this one brush. Oh, it's his masculinity, and boy, does he have too much of it, I think is the subtext there of that phrase, toxic masculinity. Mm-hmm. So it's also, I think, used to put men down when they have a really reasonable concern. I think we have this weird thing going on in our society where we really complain and criticize those men who don't share their feelings. Then when they do share their feelings, all hell breaks loose, because really at the end of the day, the message is we really don't want to hear about men and their feelings. So toxic masculinity, for a guy who shares his feelings, often he'll end up getting accused of being controlling or something like that. And at the risk of turning off, the audience, the female portion of our audience, I think it's to be aware of that and to use the term guardedly, I think is helpful. Now, if the term is helpful, like I have people who in my practice who struggle with all kinds of pathologies, including a toxic level of shyness or a toxic level of predisposition to say something harmless like gambling, which for most people is just pure recreation, but for some it becomes a compulsion. And when we talk about toxic masculinity, I think if we're going to use it in a negative sense, the truly negative sense that resonates with everybody, it would make sense to talk about it as those individuals who are driven by their insecurity into a rigid form of masculinity that is not so much masculinity as it is a betrayal of their own insecurity. Mm. So that kind of thing where the archetype would be the controlling father who wants everybody into the car to go on the vacation at dark 30 because damn it, we want to get the full value of our vacation. And, he's pounding the table and, no, we're not going to stop to go to the bathroom. I told you to go to the bathroom before we left. And so, 10 hours later, after the children have been crying and everything, okay, now we're at the hotel and now we can start the vacation. And, it's just, I think calling some of these problems toxic masculinity blinds us to the fact that it's Steve's problem or Jason's problem or John's problem, or, it's an individual problem more than it is, I think, a societal construct. And I deal with this a fair amount in my practice, working as I do with so many men, where the subject comes up, and sometimes when the man is present and the wife is present, she will only talk about it when he's not present, in a solo session.
And she'll use that term toxic masculinity, like he's portraying traits, or she'll say something.
Yeah, or he's infecting our son with toxic masculinity. The whole big boys don't cry and stop being such a baby. You're acting like a girl. All of that kind of stuff, and that's so negative and so damaging that, I can join with anybody in decrying that sort of thing. I just don't like calling it masculinity because it's really sort of, I would say, faux masculinity more than, and it is toxic, but it's toxic is sort of more a byproduct of the fact that it has really nothing to do with masculinity at all. Mm-hmm. My own sense of that, with the most people allude somehow to John Wayne and how you got to cowboy up and be the tough guy. And I do understand the history behind all of that, but for my clients and for the women in their lives, I think it helps to hear the idea that if I'm going to be a man, a real man, I got to be man enough to face my own fears and to face my own feelings, whatever they are, whatever the truth is. And so for me as a therapist, a simple reframe of that whole idea of manhood is actually fairly straightforward and pretty simple. And even the guys who I would say are caught up in the throes of a rigid view of masculinity, when they get a chance to think about it and somebody's saying something worth hearing, they relax and they go, yeah, I guess I never thought of it that way. So to me, it seems not to be so much something that's wrong with men as it seems to be just one of thousands of irrational beliefs that men and women can get caught up in. Because I'm laughing to myself because I'm thinking of all the dates I've been on with women who were annoyed with my talking about something that was of concern to me or that was bothering me, or letting her know what my feelings were. And I remember multiple times the complaint would be, you always want to talk about your feelings. Why are you always talking about your feelings? and of course, and then, gosh, what was, or you always want to talk about things. Why do you always want to talk about things? As if that's a bad thing. And
did you feel like it was a bad thing at the time? Like, were people saying that, and were you feeling bad about it?
Well, I think I had figured out by the time I was engaged in all that much talking, and I'm really not, I don't think a lot more talkative than anybody else, but I'm committed to the idea of sharing who I am, because in a relationship based on equality, not only am I mad to learn who she is, I also want her to know who I am, because both experiences are pleasurable to me, and I would hope both would be pleasurable to any potential partner.
Yeah. So
the idea that I'm going to withhold my feelings, or I'm just going to wait until I hear her feelings and then nod my head in agreement. Yeah, that sounds right. I think that's really about currying favor and not so much of a reflection of a mindset that's seeking equality as it is about seeking approval. So sometimes equality has got to make room for those of us who are involved in the relationship to disagree with one another. And that too is part of a very important part, I think, of getting to know each other. How do we disagree? Do we disagree comfortably? Can we disagree and joke about it, or work through problems efficiently and effectively? That's all good. But I think for the women at that time, there was a dark chapter of my life where I was going
dark. This is after the divorce?
Dating.
Date.
Colon, the dark years.
Oh, okay.
There was a dark chapter of my life where I just seemed to be in this grind of meeting women who found a man who talks to be a threatening entity. And so, but I wanted some room for me in the relationship. And besides the pleasure aspect, I also wanted to stick up for myself. So it seemed odd to me. I ended up getting in, some fairly mild arguments because I got dumped pretty quickly most of the time. But
what were they like? Were they ghosting you back then, or this is back in?
Yeah, that was
still a thing back then.
Oh, absolutely. Phone calls wouldn't get returned, or they'd just be fading out. Yeah. We could do something sometime, maybe. So I just eventually, would fade away myself, getting the message, oh, she's just not that into me. But part of what I was experiencing was, I think, the sexism that women grow up with, that is a direct consequence of us men not sharing our lives with them. So in the echo chamber of their own minds, without any data that tells them otherwise, they develop an idea of what is the right way for men to behave. And it's really parallel to the way we men think when we think about the ideal woman, I mean, besides the figure and the looks and all of that, we often have an irrational belief, well, that if she could just be more like us, she'd be really great.
Yeah.
And so a lot of immature men and immature women who don't have much life experience, they're attracted to the other person, and they like their looks and they like their style, or they like whatever it is they like about them. But then they invariably tend to find it annoying that, when children come along, he doesn't parent the way I parent. She doesn't parent the way that I parent. They don't think about politics or keeping house or any of the other subjects in life the way that I do. And I think some of that is individualistic, right? I mean, we're all individuals with our own point of view, but some of it is cultural, and in the sense that there is a culture of men and there's a culture of women, and there are just some really good things about being a man, and some really challenging things about being a man, as is true of women.
Yeah,
there's some great things about being a woman and some challenging things about being a woman, and we all have to work through that individually, right? So this idea of toxicity to me is, I hope I'm not rambling on because I have a lot to say on this.
Yeah, no. I was just gonna say, like, so you believe it's just like kind of like a construct, or it seems.
Yeah, so and I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, so many people talk about it, and it's like but it seems to me like you're saying it's something that is kind of a negative connotation, something that kind of lumps men in a specific group, or like it's not something that you typically enjoy. Or is that right?
Well, if I were the guy on the receiving end of a criticism about toxic masculinity, I think the person talking to me would probably get farther just addressing me as an individual.
Yeah.
I notice that when feelings come up, you get uncomfortable and you clam up. Or I notice that when this kind of thing happens around you, you end up getting quiet and you seem really angry. What's going on with that? And it may be, I'm open to the idea that there is such a thing as a toxic masculinity. But again, as I said at the intro, it's a double-edged sword, because there's also a lot of beautiful things about being a man that I enjoy, and I think most men enjoy. And that could be another whole show in and of itself, I think. But I think for men to genuinely appreciate the differences between men and women, and to savor who she is as an individual and as a woman, so different from himself, is a joyful moment. And I would hope that it would be the same for women who enjoy men in that way, or even women who prefer women romantically and sexually, to have male friends and to really enjoy them for their different perspective and their different outlook on life, and the way that they experience pain, or the way that they experience love and relationships. I think about, for me, there's a couple of things that come up. One is, when I was dating, before I met and married, I think my rebuttal to the women in my life who would say, you always want to talk about things, is that, well, I've learned that life goes much better with letting my partner know who I am and what I'm thinking than without.
Yes.
It's just like life. I also got criticized for thinking too much. And I think life goes better with thinking than without thinking. And I think relationships where we actually know what the other person thinks and feels is part of the intimate exchange. So when it comes to children, the beauty of this system of having two different worldviews and two different mindsets, even between two gay men or two gay women, the beauty of having two individuals there is you get a different perspective, instead of two people enforcing one set of values in lockstep.
Yeah.
So a man and woman at the base of a tree watching little Billy climbing, or little Susie climbing up the tree. And quite often the stereotype turns out to be true, where mom is really concerned and is calling up to her daughter or son, be careful, don't fall, look out, I don't think you should go any higher. And the dad is stereotypically and in real life most of the time saying things like, okay, now lift up your right leg. Yeah, your right leg. That's it. A little bit higher. You got it. You got it. Okay, now pull yourself up. Because one focused parent is concerned with safety. And another focused parent is concerned with success. And which parent does a child need? I would argue both.
Both, yeah.
Right, because without a concern for safety, I think a lot of kids could die. And without a concern for success, a lot of kids would be boringly safe, but woefully lacking in achievement. So it's wonderful to have both. And unfortunately, in our culture, we don't tend to appreciate both or teach the appreciation of both worldviews. So,
do you think you were ahead of your time when you were dating with the women who?
No, I kept wondering, why am I getting rejected all the time? How come this is happening?
But do you think that was because they were like, kind of like we were discussing, they were kind of raised a specific way, and their idea of what a man should be was based on previous things, maybe their fathers, and it's like, my dad didn't talk this much, or
right.
And then, but now I feel like you would be high in demand, because I feel like women now want that. I feel like
I think you're right. I think at least the women I meet and read about who are not getting married, that group especially, the women who are, even maybe dating, but with kind of an empty heart. They've been disappointed so many times because when they go out, the guy they're with only wants to talk about his accomplishments and all the wonderful things he's done. And he really can't engage in an emotionally intimate conversation, whether it's about our upbringings or what's our family history, or what's gone on in our previous relationships, or how we felt about a piece of art, like a movie or a book we read. And it's not that men don't have those feelings. I think by and large, men have been discouraged from talking about those feelings, either from their parents or from previous romantic relationships, maybe even made fun of by other boys in school or other men in their adult life. But for whatever reason, it's incredible. I think for a lot of women, especially, I would say, intelligent women who are really looking for partnerships based on equality, men are incredibly boring. And I say that because I work with men so much, and I love working with men. I love helping men. But one of the more common things I hear from my male clients is, well, I did all that for all those years because I never really thought about any of this stuff. I didn't know any of this stuff. I didn't know how to talk about that. And it's not that they're not willing. It's just that they need to learn. And an example would be learning to talk about your feelings. It takes me about one session to teach a man how to talk about his feelings. And for the average guy, they're good to go. And maybe a guy who is a little slower might need a little refresher the following session. But then the real fireworks start, because most of us guys are living a life where the world really doesn't want to know what we're feeling. They don't want to know how we're feeling about our job or about our relationship or about, how much it sucks to be a parent sometimes, or any of the other things that we have to say, other than, yeah, baby, I love you too, or yeah, me too, I feel the same way, or yeah, I really liked that. That was great. And to get into the deeper, darker, swirling waters of our individualism and really discover one another, I think women are at the disadvantage of, unfortunately, dating the men who've been trained not to share this part of themselves.
Yeah. So it's essentially a lack of awareness or understanding that it's okay for men to even have these conversations.
Yeah. And then for lack of practice, if I really don't see the world of emotions for its brilliant, amazing, colorful self for what it is, then I'm going to tend to move on to the next subject, so for a lot of us guys, it might be our careers or perhaps our avocation, like working on our cars or shooting guns. Because what man is going to criticize you for working on your car or shooting a gun? But men are extremely sensitive, and little boys in general are extremely sensitive, and they get hurt easily, and it hurts so bad, they learn to not look at that stuff.
So do you feel like the phrase toxic masculinity even puts more of a disservice on that sort of idea or the concept of men? Because I don't know, it's like you said, masculinity to me, again, there's things to embrace within it, but if it goes too far or if it's come at too aggressively, it can become quote unquote toxic, I guess.
Well, right, like any beautiful thing, life itself can devolve and end up in cancers taking over the body. We can have music that becomes dissonant and discordant and painfully loud and lose our hearing and really feel deeply emotionally troubled over it. So really anything that's inherently beautiful can be made into something that's ugly. Myself, I don't think there'd be anything lost in losing the phrase toxic masculinity, but as long as it's going to be used by some people, I think we should all be talking about what it means, at least what it means to us. And I don't know anybody other than people who, I guess I do know, just as there are misogynist men out there, I do know some women who hate men. And I know men who are trying to get laid by joining that hate parade. And and they'll talk a lot about, I know, it's just toxic masculinity. I hate that stuff. And when really they haven't really given it any thought, they're just paying lip service to what she said. I'll have what she's having, kind of a way of thinking.
And then how about the men that you're helping in your group and the people who do need help with the emotions? Is there any resistance to them, or are they eager to learn? Like how are men reciprocating this sort of information when you do give it to them? Because that's another thing. There's just
like so many ideas along this line, how men react is on a spectrum. And so there are some men who are just relieved that they get to go ahead and let go of the rigidity. There are other men who, are curious, but they don't really have any particular emotional investment, because some men actually are already good at this, right? And then there are still other men who are so fearful of all of this, fearful for their own masculine reputation, their own manhood, their identity as a man, that they just get angry. And then they sit there sullenly looking at me or staring at the floor because they find this whole conversation really inherently girly, or usually in this toxic political environment of ours, it gets categorized as something having to do with liberalism or being a libtard. I think somebody like the deceased Rush Limbaugh would probably have been more in that category.
Okay.
Or at least talking that way, because I think if we listen to any of his old shows, we're not going to find a lot of deep feelings and subtle, affective nuance.
And as a therapist, what is that they're covering up? They're afraid to be vulnerable, or what is that?
Well, I think men have by and large given up the rich and satisfying world of their own emotions for, as the Bible would put it, a mess of pottage. There's just nothing. For some, it's that they can have a reputation and be left alone because they're a real man. For others, it's all about winning fights, verbal and otherwise. And like an argument about a vacation. No, I don't want to go there because it just costs too much. Or I don't want to go there because it's just too boring. And instead of talking about how he feels, which at the end of the day, isn't that what a vacation and a life is all about? Is, well, what makes me happy and what doesn't make me happy? What brings me joy and what doesn't bring me joy? And whether it's a vacation or a life or any subset of those two, I definitely would prefer to be happy than not. Well, to find happiness, it's a little bit like a geography quiz. To get to one city, you have to let me know where I am, because if you want the directions from where you are to where I am, I have to know how I'm situated and how you're situated. And if you don't tell me where you are, how could I possibly give you directions? Mm-hmm. In the same way, if a woman never hears her husband say, "I feel lonely and unappreciated," how would she possibly even know how to begin addressing a problem? And most women, I think, are married to men who would never hear those words. And if they did hear those words, it's so seldom that they would become probably defensive, because they're just not used to sharing feelings and relaxing with that. "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Tell me more." And then just listening. "Well, what would you like to see different?" That kind of thing. What would make you feel valued? What would make you feel loved? What would make you happy? And sometimes the person says something that is absolutely unacceptable to the other, and that's fine. It's just information. Mm-hmm. Well, if you need that, I'm probably not the right person for you. That's harsh. Or to say something like, "Well, if you need that, I'm going to have to do a lot of thinking. Can we have some time to think this over?"
Yeah.
And if it's been, typically it's been years since he shared a feeling, if he ever did, other than the positive ones. "I'm happy, I love you," that kind of thing. But if you take years before you share feelings, it might take a minute or two to kind of work through those as a couple. Mm-hmm. But I think most couples could, if they were given a reasonable and fair chance to work through, because we are all human, and our problems are human problems capable of human solution. So if I don't feel valued, there's probably some easy fixes in that. I remember being in a relationship with a woman where I said something like, "I don't feel loved." And she said, "Well, I love you." I said, "Really? You do?" "Well, yeah." I said, "Do you even like me? Can you name 3 things you like about me?" And she was stuck for something to say. Uh-huh. And I think for men and women, we just get so on autopilot in our love affairs that we often will say, "I love you," when we really don't. Mm. What we mean is, we have that initial surge of passion, and I don't mean just lust, but even love, but it's very superficial because we don't yet know the person. And it makes no sense to me that we would say we love somebody, but there's nothing we like about them.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to, she asked me, "Well, what would it take for," that same woman asked me, "What would it take for me to feel loved?" And I said, "Well, if you could just look at me once a day and say, 'I love you' in a heartfelt manner. Uh-huh. And if you kissed me goodbye and hello, and if we had sex, once a day in a way that felt genuine and connected, I would feel loved." And she looked at me, and it was a moment I'll never forget. She looked at me and she said, "Yeah, I can't do that."
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So good for her that she knew herself well enough. Mm-hmm. And poor me that it took me so long to figure out how to say those words.
How long were you together for?
Oh, that had been like a relationship that had gone on for more than a year. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah. So it just,
quite some time.
Yeah. And it was because, when I was younger, I just wasn't aware of any of my emotional needs. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many people listening to this have had a different experience, but I would guess it would be a very small percentage of the listening audience has had the experience of knowing exactly what they need emotionally when they got into their very first significant relationship. Because most of us struggle with that. We weren't raised knowing, and we also have these irrational beliefs. I had one, for example, when I got into my young adult years. I thought everybody liked hugging and kissing if they were in love.
Yeah.
And if they didn't like hugging and kissing, that meant they weren't in love. Mm-hmm. But lo and behold, the world has a number of people who are not that fond of physical affection.
Yeah.
And most people fall somewhere on a continuum, but by no means do the majority fall exactly where you and I might be, in a given spot in our lives.
Yeah.
So that was one big wake-up call for me. And then there are lots of other emotional needs. Some people get their emotional needs for status met only through having lots of money or lots of prestige in the community. And others of us are nearly colorblind when it comes to status. We just don't care about it. It's not significant. We have a few friends and we're happy with that.
Yeah. And then when that woman did say that to you, and then
I can't do that for you.
Yeah. And I assume you broke up.
Yeah.
And how did you feel about that?
About the breakup?
Yeah.
Mixed. I think, for me, most all of my breakups start with love and end with a profound level of unhappiness and dissatisfaction. But the love, I've never stayed around long enough to make sure I stomped the love to death entirely. So there was always, I think of that song, a country song about stomping in my heart like it was Texas or something. And I think for most of us who are genuinely in love, any breakup is somewhat, I think the correct word would be ambivalent, because we have mixed feelings about it, of relief that the pain is over, and sorrow, and even maybe loneliness that we're no longer with our adored beloved.
Did you feel empowered though, because you did ask so clearly what you wanted, and then the person said no, and then were you at that phase where you could see that the needs just weren't able to be met, and that
I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think my experience is parallel to everyone listening, and that is I was like a blind man in a goat's stomach, just trying to feel my way through the early stages of this. But as the years went on, asking the right questions and getting the clear answers felt more, and then just the process of letting go like a grown-up, it felt more and more like an adult way to live, instead of that immature kind of 13-year-old, but I love her, that kind of stuff.
Well, that's how it is for me now. And it's like, if I was in your shoes and I was dating someone like that, and then you realize, hopefully before a year goes by, or I feel like I'm quicker to see like what's missing and then express it. And then if somebody can't give that to you, it's kind of just like, I mean, of course there's going to be some sadness and emotions attached to it, unless you're like a robot or whatever, which I am half robot. So, but I feel like I know like what it would be down the road. It's like, it'd be convincing and reaching and trying so desperately to get these needs met that this person can never fulfill. And it's just going to be a very hard relationship.
Oh, and it's going to be fraught with all kinds of temptations that you never thought you would be prey to, because if you're not getting your emotional needs met in your relationship, and I'm talking about your basic emotional needs, like I had breakfast today with male friends, as I do every Friday, and I found myself just really reveling in it, enjoying it, and they do meet a different set of emotional needs than my relationship with my wife. But it's because we're complicated, we're complex creatures, and we have a lot of different emotional needs. And sometimes I tire of the company of even the women I love the most in the whole world. And I enjoy and celebrate the companionship of my male friends. And then sometimes it's the opposite. I need to get away from them and get my needs met, with the women in my life, whether it's family or otherwise. And I think, though, that we were talking about your emotional needs, your journey, and the journey that parallels, I think, everybody else out there, including me. And that is, if I'm not getting my needs met, my basic needs met, then I'm far more likely to end up in an affair, to end up divorced, to end up in some kind of real compromised situation that was really not on my list of things to do in my lifetime.
Yeah.
So it helps to know what you're doing. And again, I'll make one really impassioned call for a more human sort of sex education that contextualizes human sexuality in the context of human relationships. Because the reason we date, the reason we get married is because of our sexuality. If we had zero sexual interest whatsoever in that kind of companionship, we wouldn't be doing that. Mm-hmm. And so, of course you're not like Spock or a robot, because otherwise you wouldn't be interested in the relationship to begin with. Mm-hmm. And I think some of my retreat into a Spock-like approach, or retreat into a more robotic cadence in my speaking, is because I'm being defensive over my poor widow feelings.
Yeah. Well, I think like with helping the guys like get in touch with their feelings, and then they're able to express this stuff at an earlier stage. And then I don't know, like to me it seems to like be a lot of what like dating is more about, like knowing what you want, expressing it, seeing if the person can meet you there, and then pursuing it or not pursuing it. And if you live it that way and you go about it that way, there's a lot less probability that you're going to be like heartbroken and devastated from all the other stuff. So it's like, if you don't know how to talk about it, it's going to be...
Well, and there are cultures that discourage any kind of contact between boys and girls, or men and women after a certain age. And a lot of religions do that as well. And the downside of that is we end up being emotionally retarded in our development, because we really don't know what we need or how to talk to the opposite sex about who we are and what we want and what we have to offer in a life. And I see that in my office all the time. I mean, it's like giving a marriage without that sort of experience of getting to know people and really learning more about yourself. It's like handing off the keys to the Ferrari, to the person who just got their driver's license and who's, never had any real experience driving a car. That would be insane. Yeah. So, so I think it's super important. But again, going back to the world of feelings, if I want to be happy, I have to know what my feelings are. And to me, this is an essential element of good parenting. Just like that song that's "Mothers Don't Let Your Boys Grow Up to Be Cowboys." Mothers and fathers, don't let your boys grow up to be emotionally retarded and incapable of identifying and expressing their feelings. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to make that rhyme.
Yeah, that's true.
So, I just think everybody should be able to be self-aware, mm-hmm. and to be able to take ownership of their inner dialogue and their feelings, mm-hmm. and to be able to share that at will when they feel safe and comfortable doing so. And it's just a basic human skill. It's a basic intimacy skill. And if we're not teaching our boys how to do that, then we're really teaching them how to fail in their future relationships.
Mm-hmm. Would you define that sort of skill set of having that as a masculine trait?
Oh, wow. I would say it's a human trait, but that is manifested differently with men than it is with women. And here's one of my chances to celebrate one of the things I love about men. I think men and women are self-sacrificial, each in their own way. For a woman to get pregnant, for example, I think is a supreme act of self-sacrifice, because in evolutionary terms, she's allowing her body to become the protective cocoon, or the shell of the egg protecting the life within it. And only for 9 months, that's really a lot to ask. Yeah. And men have their own ways of giving life, quite often by sacrificing themselves as well. Like, so many of the movies we've all seen about ships that get torpedoed in a war, and there's some guy on the other side of the bulkhead who's locking himself in rather than trying to open the hatch and escape the encroaching water. Yeah. And he's giving up his life in an effort to save the rest of his shipmates. Mm-hmm. And that's love, man. That is a lot of love, but it very often gets forgotten. And or for a dad to climb down into a coal mine and work his guts out for 20, 30, 40 years supporting his family, getting black lung disease, doing all the other things. And why does he do it? In the old days, I don't know what people do now. They probably take out their phone, but in the old days, they would take out their wallets and show you pictures of their kids and their wife. And where they do what they do out of love. But if you don't understand that, it just seems like dad's not here. Dad's AWOL. Dad's not there for me the way mom was. No, he was there for you. You just didn't understand it as a kid because he was gone.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to love about men and the way that they do things and the way they can do things. Even compartmentalization, which gets a lot of bad press. Compartmentalization allows men to make those sorts of sacrifices. And without that, no sane man would climb into a coal mine or work in a steel foundry where he could, get his limbs burned off in a moment. I mean, it just, you'd want to run from something like that. Yeah. But instead, we calculate the risks and we very carefully go about trying to provide for our families the same way a prehistoric man would go out hunting and quite often risk his life trying to bring home food. Yeah. And it's all good. It's just evolution has not created junk in the human species. Men are the way they are for good reasons. Women are the way they are for very good reasons. And we would all be the better off if we could just really dig in and learn how to appreciate one another for our differences, as well as the common ground or the compatible areas of our life.
And what would you say are some of the traits of men that allow them to be better in relationships? I mean, we talked about expressing emotions. Is there like a list of things that make...
When you say better, did you mean better than they were? Or better than women? Or better than...
just like not better. I mean, I guess the word would be that makes them...
as wonderful as they are?
As wonderful as they can be without like getting too... Like one thing is like men aren't talked about. Like we talked about how they don't know how to express emotions.
Well, I'll say this to the women out there. There's a bunch of women out there who do know all this about men and will go out of their way to acknowledge men's accomplishments. And men invariably feel like just devastated by compliments like that because we feel like finally somebody gets me, somebody appreciates me. When my wife says, "Thank you, honey, for working so hard for us today." Yeah. It's like, yeah, I wasn't home all day because I was working a 12-hour day. And for me to feel appreciated in that moment is great. Now, I think that's a difference between men and women in that I was raised by a single mom who worked really hard and made tremendous sacrifices. So I understand women can do that. The difference, I think, is that men are really so much more willing and take so much more satisfaction in their work. Even some silly example like mowing the lawn. I know my mom, when I was little, would go out and mow the lawn before I was big enough to take care of that myself. But the difference between her is she would just get this drudgery and this chore done with and then go on. Whereas for me, even as a teenager, I would stand back and I'd look and then I'd take out the clippers and go, okay, I missed a couple spots. And I'd stand back and appreciate what I did and take satisfaction in it. And that's in a way sort of pathetic and kind of funny in a cosmic humor kind of way that a guy would take such satisfaction in doing any kind of a job. But I did.
Law gene.
Yeah. but I think men tend to do that, whereas I think for women, their big job is so much more relationally oriented in general. And even to a male and female who are in the corporate environment, and they're both up in the C-suites, on the top floor, they take different levels of appreciation in what it is they've contributed and what it is they've focused on. And for a woman, it might be more her team that she's built. And typically guys are more focused on, their sacrifices and what they themselves have accomplished. And in some areas, it's really kind of laughable because it's childish to think that you made this corporation successful on your own, because it's always a team. Yeah. And the same thing is true of families. I think men have a bit of a blind spot in the rearview mirror when it comes to seeing the value of teamwork, even though we participate in athletic teams a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But I think women are naturally, and I don't think it's just cultural. I think culture reinforces it, but I think women naturally want to watch movies about relationships,
Mm-hmm.
because for them, really, movies about relationships aren't just satisfying; those are training films for how they should live their lives, and what went wrong in the movie, and what that lady should have done with that guy, and all of that. Whereas for us, typically, most guys aren't not terribly into those movies.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm a little bit different because I'm a therapist and I have some interest in human relationships. But delving into human relationships and their pain is something people have to pay me to do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't do that recreationally. Yeah. Like, oh, let's watch Kramer versus Kramer and see what a family with a heartbreaking divorce arguing about the boy they have in common.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just excruciatingly painful for me. I'd much rather watch 100,000 enemy soldiers come over the hill and see the machine guns blowing blowing people away and all of that. And it's much less painful in that way. You can see it in little boys and girls cartoons as well. Mm-hmm. Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner and all of those, there's a lot of violence. Yeah. And it's cartoonish because we males, I think, often make it into a cartoon in our mind. Mm. Why? Well, because killing living things is really hard on our soul. Mm-hmm. So we have to have some defense mechanism. And I think girls quite rightly find that stuff off-putting, and they watch other kinds of cartoons if they watch cartoons at all.
Mm. So was the idea then, I guess, for both men and women, and just to embrace the masculine or feminine traits or the things that the individuals bring to the relationship rather than criticize it, or I guess.
Yeah. I think that's a summary that sounds really simple when you say it. I was hoping I was sounding much more brilliant than that when I was saying it, but I think that's really true. There are amazing traits women bring to planet Earth that, as a group, the human race would be so much the poorer for not having them. If men could reproduce asexually, but just dividing cells and, giving birth to a little clone somehow, that would be, we would be the poorer for that. I think women enrich our race, the human race, to infinite levels. Mm-hmm. But I think the same is true with men. And I think I'm always suspicious when there's something to be said about, let's say a term like misogyny, but there isn't a commonly used term that explains women's dislike of men. Mm-hmm. And a term like masculine or toxic masculinity, but there's not a comparable term that explains women who are maybe overly feminized in a caricaturish sort of way. And I think that if we could just learn to have some sort of deep and mutual appreciation of each other, because for me, I no longer believe, but I have a holy trinity that consists of reason, knowledge, and the service to humanity. Mm-hmm. And I think when you rationally look at our history and you explore the processes, the miraculous processes of evolution, it's pretty clear that the human race has evolved to an extraordinary level of accomplishment, and that we are capable of doing amazing things, particularly if we can coexist lovingly and peacefully.
And they get that, and to do that is by talking.
Yeah. Starting with, we have to learn to value each other. Yeah. And I think mothers and fathers have so much to do with this. My mom was a single mom, like I've said so many times, but a lot of guys are raised by single moms. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, those guys end up hearing a lot of criticism of themselves as men. And I think part of that is they haven't found their way as men because their mother was the sole source of all the love and support they got growing up. And until you realize, there's this whole other half of the human race, that is the men who also offer love and support, if you think women have all of the important stuff to give, then women become gods, and we become guilty of idolatry and worshiping them in an unhealthy way. But if we realize, no, women can make great girlfriends or great wives, but at the end of the day, they're just people. And so are we. We can become great husbands, great boyfriends, but we're just people. We're not, gods, except maybe in our own minds. And we need to knock that shit off.
Yeah. And what about another thing I was thinking about with just like, I guess, personality wise with men, as far as their behavior possibly being toxic, like what role does personality disorders play within that?
Okay, all bets are off. Once you introduce personality disorders, you have to start really, that's a whole nother
thing.
Yeah, because just like, and I want to make this super straightforward and easy, and it's I'm not dumbing it down for anybody, but even the best experts in the world need a patient to be sober for a year before they can honestly and accurately diagnose a personality disorder.
Oh.
Because the intoxication or the chronic abuse of drugs and alcohol so simulate a personality disorder, one or the other, that you can't tell the difference. Well, when we talk, you don't even have to know what personality disorders are when you know what I just said, because none of us would mindfully run into the arms of somebody we knew had an unsolved, terrible drinking problem or drug problem.
Yeah.
Because when they're under the influence, we're not there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't matter.
Yeah.
So then we get to deal with that. And that talk about impairment.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't drive your car across town because you're so impaired by the chemicals you downloaded, you're certainly not going to be able to develop a family life that's rich and meaningful and nurturing for the children.
Yeah. And then how about one final question on this? Like, how about the role of men in other men's lives, like men's groups or just things like that? Like, as far as, I guess, creating a better sense of their own masculinity or their own sense of self. Is that helpful with you as far as like running men's groups? Have you seen that camaraderie?
Absolutely. I think it's really, men are missing out when they don't have male friends. Mm-hmm. And their wives are missing out when he doesn't have male friends, just as he's missing out when she doesn't have female friends. Mm-hmm. Because as wonderful as we all are, and I do believe that, it's not just a thing I say, we are in no way capable of meeting all of the needs of another human being all of the time. We all need friends.
Yeah.
And what's really great for me as a man having male friends is that they are far more accepting of my masculinity, my maleness, far less critical, affirming, while at the same time challenging me to be a better man. Mm-hmm. Men have the courage, at least real friends, have the courage to do that with their fellow man. And, there's nothing like being at a table full of good friends when one of them raises an eyebrow at you and says something like, "You really sure about that? That sounds pretty fucked up." Mm-hmm. And it's like, now we got to talk about it. So we can't just say, "You're mean." We have to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And I celebrate male friendship for that, because we get to, again, wade out into those deeper waters of those issues that, really, I think that is the discerning difference, the discriminating difference between males in my life and good, healthy male friendships. Because not all men are capable of helping me to become a better man. Mm-hmm. But virtually any guy who has the courage to just be himself and to confront me as necessary out of love, that guy's going to help me be a better man.
Have you ever had a friendship that wasn't helping you be a better man?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And what was the reason that it wasn't helping you?
Well, I've had friends who drink themselves to death. And I didn't even think it was a problem for years and years, because I wasn't that close, or I wasn't his drinking companion. Mm-hmm. And I've known people for decades. You can know somebody for a long, long time, but they keep vast parts of the inner territory secret.
Mm-hmm.
So whether they have a drug or alcohol problem or an eating disorder or, God, 1,001 different problems, sometimes we're just too defended to open up and let people in. And then once I did find out about it, I did try to be that friend who helped him. And because I think, again, Benjamin Franklin is correct. A friend in need is a friend indeed. And I was trying to be indeed his friend when he was in great need. And he just couldn't face it. Like so many people with serious problems, he just was never able to have the courage to face it head on. And, I still miss him to this day because I had a lot of love for that guy. And, none of us are perfect. And I get that. But every once in a while we lose somebody. I've had friends I've lost in a variety of ways. And like I said before, people are complicated.
Have you had any that were like abusive towards you, or anything where you had to like end the friendship for that reason, or anything?
Well, I've talked to other men who have had that experience. And what I've done is confronted the friend who was being verbally abusive of me. And generally that confrontation, again, powered by the knowledge of my own feelings and my comfort level talking about my feelings. Hey, when you talk to me that way, I got to let you know that is entirely unacceptable. I don't talk to you like that, and it's never going to be okay for you to talk to me like that. And every guy I've ever confronted knows that they crossed a line. They know that internally, and they say, yeah, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I apologize. And then we move on. And I'm cool with that because there aren't too many unforgivable sins. I can't even think of any that a friend could commit. If I had a friend who was in the front page of the paper for having a sexual liaison with a goat on Main Street, after I bailed him out, I'd want to know, so what was that all about? Well, I wouldn't stop being his friend. People do goofy things. People do dumb things. And I'm sure there's a story there worth hearing.
Well, we're going to have to hear that goat story someday whenever you get that call. But cool. Well, let's wrap it up there. And to end, we'll actually go into we have a listener question here. And again, for the people.
More? You want more? Oh my God.
Well, this will be different than the toxic masculinity or the conversation we just had. And again, if you're listening, if you have a question for Steve, you could visit stevening.com and fill out the contact form. So let's see. So this week's question is as follows. So I'll just read it to you and then you could just respond.
Okay.
So the question says, my husband won't go to marriage counseling because he says most people who do end up getting divorced. Is that true? It's good. Kind of in line with what we've been talking about in a way.
Kind of. And I'm tempted to make a joke. Yes, it's true. He won't go to marriage counseling. But as to why, I think men come up with a lot of different reasons. And generally, right, it is the man. It's not always the man, but quite often it is the man who is the one who's more reluctant to go to marriage counseling. Well, why? Because everything we've been talking about, this whole vast swirling eddy of confusion and talking about feelings, and invariably he knows he's going to be confronted about things he's probably doing wrong, and it's going to be shameful and humiliating, and the therapist will probably be some gay dude who does it right, and then he meets me and he goes, yeah, see, I told you. And so I think for me,
do people think you're
I get that all the time. Are you kidding me? That's why I have pictures of my wife all over the place. But I don't have pictures of my wife all over the place, but I do sometimes think, and I explain to them, no, I just dress this way. These pink pants do not mean that I'm gay, but I just have a great fashion sense. So, I think on a somewhat deeper level, just like when you go to a health food store of some kind, you'll see a lot of people who look very ill. And the reason for that is we take our health for granted until something goes wrong. And then we realize, I need to attend to this. And shame on us maybe for not attending to it earlier, but there we are looking for help. And the same thing is true with counseling. A lot of times failure is baked into the cake when we get at the time of the wedding. If I don't know how to talk about my feelings, damn, I don't even know what my feelings are. How could I talk about them? Mm-hmm. How is it going to be possible for her not to experience an overwhelming sense of loneliness when she tries to emotionally connect? And for my children to struggle when they have no idea what dad is really thinking or what he's really feeling. So it is true. A lot of marriages end in divorce after going to marriage counseling. But there's an old Roman saying in Latin, post hoc ergo propter hoc, where after this, therefore because of this, just because you went to the marriage counseling session doesn't mean that the marriage counseling session caused the breakup. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, though, I have to plead guilty to this because, as I explained to my clients, I'm not really here to save your marriage. Mm-hmm. I'm here to empower my clients. And as I look about the room, I only count two, him and her, or him and him. And for some people, that's wonderful news. And for some people, that's terrifying news. Mm-hmm. But if I'm a good counselor, I think that means I'm going to empower my clients to do what is in their best interest and to really start taking great care of themselves as adults should. And quite often, when we get married the first time, hopefully not too often the second time, but unfortunately it is also true the second and third and fourth time, we are making a big mistake. Mm-hmm. And until we examine that mistake, we're going to be condemned to repeat it. So even if the divorce is baked in, even if there's going to be a divorce, I think it's important to go to therapy for that couple to learn what they need to learn, or at least begin the process of teaching themselves outside of therapy what it is they need to learn to make sure they never make the same mistake twice.
Wow. So it's kind of like you're doing like a healing thing with looking at the relationship and understanding that it's broken and unrepairable, but then healing the man and the woman, or the couple, in a way that then allows them to probably leave each other with more peace too, I would imagine.
Right. They're two amazing, wonderful people who can get a lot of help and go on and have an even better life, and including a better life with each other if they're open to that. Mm-hmm. A better life in the sense of, as divorced people, co-parenting together, or people who really did care about each other but mistakenly formed a marriage rather than accepting they were just too incompatible to really make that work.
And have you seen it to where people have gone to counseling and then stayed together, or is it kind of a more smaller percentage?
Well, it's funny, you'd say that because I take great pleasure. I'm an American. I like a happy ending and seeing mm-hmm. people live happily ever after. So that works for me. But so often people come to a marriage and family therapist's office really just to check one more moral box on the way out the door. Mm. It's sort of like the therapist is part of the cleanup crew. Before you go to the lawyer, you go to the therapist, check that box to make sure you've, quote, tried everything, unquote. And then those people, I think, are so hurt. There's so much damage that there's really nothing anybody could say that would, help repair this. They're too broken to even begin the process of repairing. And for some people, again, it's wonderful to move on. But for other people, it's certainly possible to work through problems. One of the happiest and easiest therapy sessions I ever had was with a middle-aged couple who were just so livid with each other, and they'd been angry for so long. And, he was mad at her because no matter what he planned or how careful he was, she was late for every damn thing in the world. Mm-hmm. And it had him feeling embarrassed. And it was just like one of those proverbial Chinese water tortures where the same nerve just gets stomped on over and over and over. And he felt belittled because he wasn't significant enough for her to show up on time or to
Mm-hmm.
be ready on time. And for her, the issue was he was a slob. He would take his socks off and drop one or drop his shoes or some other article of clothing, and it would become invisible to him somewhere in the house. There, it existed, but he couldn't see it, not for the life of him. And so she was always picking up after him, and she didn't get into the relationship to become his maid. She felt disrespected in her own right. And then, because I am a trained clinician, I had a suspicion, and I walked them each through an assessment of ADHD. And as it turns out, they were both ADHD. And as I explained that to them in the very first session, they started looking at each other with this tenderness in their eyes. And it was like, oh, and, we just need to understand we each are attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And for some people, that means real difficulty in getting things organized. For some, it means procrastinating, and for some, it means both. And these two each had a different style of manifesting their ADHD or different symptoms, but they were both ADHD, and it was not a moral issue, and had no moral impact or content in terms of what they thought of the other person. They were both in love. They wanted to make a life together, and they enjoyed each other. There was just this thing.
Wow.
This thing. So those are super great stories, right? Because they're easy, and coming to a therapist, even an expensive one, was totally worth it for them. And then there are other people who just, like the man, never learned how to share his feelings, and once he learns to share his feelings, even though that was the presenting problem, he just can't talk. He won't share his feelings, and then he learns, and then the real problems are laid bare. And then sometimes the divorce is a consequence of solving that problem, including a problem like drinking. Somebody drinks way too much, but they find out when they're sober, I just don't like you. And so I need to get the hell out, because the only way I could stay with you is by staying drunk. Right? And that happens too.
Well, and the couple who did have the ADHD, they stayed together.
Yeah, lived happily ever after.
Yeah.
It was such a wonderful, easy problem to solve. And there are lots of other couples like that.
Yeah.
But usually happy stories are boring. But there are lots of couples like that.
All right.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think that's a great place to end, and that's a question. And yeah, that's it for us today. So thank you all for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode. All right. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Jason.